Take your Bibles this evening and open them to the 63rd Psalm, Psalm 63. And we're going to look at this psalm, and it is something that we can all relate to because we can constantly relate to it, not just an occasional moment of some type of situation, but it is really it's the ongoing experience of the life of a believer. The life of a believer should be one that has a longing for the Lord, and there are too many times where we feel like we just don't get enough of God. That's what he says in this psalm. He talks about being thirsty for God. He talks about that he is his God. If you notice there in the first verse, he says, "O God, you are my God." This psalm was probably written by David. It's believed to be written by David in some of your translations that you have in front of you. There may be a superscription that says below there that it was something like it was a psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. Most likely this psalm was written when Absalom was attempting to steal the throne from him, and it was a very dark time in the life of David. His very own son was trying to take away and attempt a coup and take away the throne from him. And so as David was going through this very painful time, he is in the wilderness and he begins to cry out to God, "O God, you are my God." As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times we look at Psalms or we look at other parts of Scripture and we think, well, that applies to me in this situation, but I'm okay 99% of the time. I really don't need that. But when you take a deeper look at this psalm, you'll realize that this is the experience of our Christian life, of the life of a believer. There's time, and I say that because there's times when you feel like you're in a spiritual desert. Have you ever been there? You remember that there were better times in your life, there were better times in your spiritual life, and then you find yourself in a sense that you are thirsty for God. You can remember when maybe the fires burned a little bit stronger in your life. You can remember when you were around people that seemed to be encouraging to you and would move you along. And then maybe you're in a time now where those encouraging people are not around you and you feel like you're in a desert. It is really a lot like feeling like you're starving, like you're thirsty, like you need water. I remember the psalmist that wrote in one of the Psalms, "My soul pants after thee like a deer." In this Psalm 63, we can share in the blessing that emerges from this person that wrote this psalm. I believe it was David, and he relates his problem of being thirsty, but then during the psalm we find that he finds joy in the communion of the Lord. Let's take a look at this. The first thing I want you to see here in verses 1 and 2 is the psalmist is longing for his presence. Longing for his presence. And I already mentioned the first line of the psalm says, "O God, you are my God." It might be the most important few words of the psalm. It really sets the stage for the rest of the psalm, because without those words, "You are my God," we don't have a personal relationship with God, do we? This is what he's talking about. He's talking about my God. And his God is someone that he stays close to. He stays right alongside. He is my God. Without God in your life in that way, in that manner, you are going to constantly feel alienated and alone in your life. But when you have a personal God where you can say, "He is my God," you have a companion and a friend that never leaves you. And that's what we all need, and that's what David would remember in this very dark time of his life when he is wandering around. His family and his close advisors had fled from Jerusalem, and were out in the wilderness of Judea, not knowing whether or not they would be apprehended by an army or if they would be apprehended by a foreign group of soldiers or what would happen to them. They had no idea. But as they are out there, this is the response that David makes. "Oh God, you are my God." He says, "Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water." I think there's a literal level here, but there's also a spiritual level of application. On the literal level, there's no doubt that he is talking literally about not having water. He is talking about his physical needs are not being met. But I think the occasion of his physical needs not being met, it reminds him of his need for dependence upon God. Notice what he says there in these lines. He says, first of all, "My soul thirsts for you." It is a spiritual hunger. It is a spiritual thirsting. And then he also says, "My flesh longs for you." And he's also talking about his physical needs. God provides both of those, both spiritual and physical needs for his people. And David knew that. And so he comes to his God and says, "My God, I have spiritual needs, but I also, God, I have physical needs." Notice there in verse 2, he says, "So I have looked for you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory." David, no doubt, this was a very sad time in his life, and he is remembering those past spiritual blessings that he experienced when he went into the house of the Lord. I am right now a little bit moved, and I'm a little bit emotional as I think about the past spiritual blessings that I've had in the house of God. The house of God should be a place where we go to for refuge. It should be a place that we go to for fellowship with other believers. It should be a place where we go to hear encouragement. It should be a place where we go to learn more about God and to worship Him. And everything that happens at the house of God should move us closer and draw us closer into a deeper relationship with Him. If you are going to the house of God and you are not being drawn closer to His Word and not learning and being fed from His Word, then you are in the wrong place. David is reminded here that he has experienced past spiritual blessings when he went to the sanctuary, and this is exactly what he mentions when he talks about being in a desert place. He says, "I'm in a desert place, my soul is thirsty, I'm in spiritual need, and I'm in physical need." And then I remember the house of the Lord, where that was the center of God's power and His glory. God's power is something that will be able to provide the needs that He's mentioned. Too many people are looking in the wrong places for spiritual and physical needs. They are taking it upon themselves to say, "Well, I've got a better plan, I've got this plan, I've got this and I've got that, and I'm going to take care of it and I will be satisfied." Dear friend, the only thing that's ever going to satisfy you both physically and spiritually is God Himself. Amen? I wanted to, something that jumped out to me when I was studying this, a couple of little cross references, and you don't have to turn there. I have them in my notes here, but John 4 is a good parallel for what is being said here for being thirsty. Do you remember what Jesus said to the Samaritan woman when He was at the well? He said in John 4:14, Jesus told the woman, "But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life." When your soul is thirsty, the answer is Jesus. We can also look at a verse in Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 17. And by the way, I did a search for thirsty and you would not believe, or thirst and thirsty, and you would not believe the number of references that come up in the Bible. This is a very common word in the Bible because God knows that we are going to experience thirst. There was the thirsting for sustenance while they were in the wilderness, while the Israelites were in the wilderness, and God provided the manna and the quail in the wilderness. He provided water while they were in the wilderness. There are so many times, there are so many different examples in the Bible where time and time again where God has provided for His thirsty people. Isaiah 41:17 says this, and this is just a truth from God, when the poor and needy seek water, and there is none, and their tongue faileth for thirst, listen to this, I, the Lord, will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. This is one of those promises that we have from the Old Testament. It is a principle of God's character that when a believer is thirsty, God is not going to turn His back on you. He will provide for your needs. The second thing I want you to see in verses 3 through 8 is finding His joy. We see the problem in verses 1 and 2. We see the thirsty situation. We see that he's hungry, he's thirsty, he has spiritual and physical needs. But also notice here, this is where the psalmist finds joy in this time of distress. Notice in verse 3, 4, and 5. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise you. Thus I will bless you while I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips. And you can already tell here in these next three verses that the psalmist finds joy, and he finds joy in the Lord. He noticed that it says in verse 3, he mentions his loving kindness. That's a word that is in the Hebrew, it is hesed. It is the loving kindness. It is the steadfast love of God. It is the kind of love that was described in the book of Ruth. It is the kind of love that is the premise for God's loyal covenant with Israel. It is steadfastness. It is a loyal love. It is loving kindness. It is the very, very epitome of the love of God for the believer. This is what the psalmist finds joy in. The psalmist finds joy in the fact that during these dark times in his life and the dark times in your life is that God's loving kindness is better than life. Do you see what that's saying there? Isn't that an interesting concept? It's not the idea that you get from the world, is it? The world wants you to think that you need to live your best life now and you need to do this and do that. A very humanistic and human-centered perspective. But this is not a human-centered perspective at all. The center here is God at the center of his life because he references the loving kindness, the loyal love of God. It goes right along with that text that I just quoted from Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 17, is that when you are thirsty, God will never leave you. That's the loyal kind of love that he's talking about here. And so he says it's better than life. Even if my life seems like it's going downhill, even my life, it seems like it's going wrong, it's going bad, his loving kindness and experiencing and remembering the steadfast, loyal love of God is better than life. That's all that he wants in life, is to be able to depend on and trust in God's loyal, steadfast love. Notice there in verse 3, it leads him to praise, doesn't it? He says, my lips shall praise you. In verse 4, it causes him to praise. And so in verse 3, it makes praise possible. But notice in verse 4, thus I will bless you while I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. And this lifting up of his hands to God is praising God. And notice in verse 5, this loyal love, it satisfies him. Notice it says, my soul shall be satisfied. And it's a comparison here to some of the best foods that you could ever come up with to make a parallel. I tell you, I had a good ham for lunch today, and I'm thinking about that marrow and that fatness. When it says that there, I remember that ham. Oh, it was so nourishing, it was so good. But look at this. My soul shall be satisfied, and my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips. And so he is saying that he is satisfied abundantly, and he makes these comparisons to physical needs. Notice here in verses 6 through 8, he talks more about the effects of God's loyal love. When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. Because you have been my help, therefore in the shadow of your wings I will rejoice. My soul follows close behind you. Your right hand upholds me. But I'm going to stop right there. Notice in verses 6 through 8, he's talking more about his loyal love. And the key word here is that he remembers, isn't he? He is laying down at night, and he is probably overcome and overwhelmed with this grief of this distress that he's going through. And I know you've been there. You find yourself in a situation, and there just isn't enough time to pray, isn't there? You cannot pray enough. You find yourself during the day stopping and praying. You're so overwhelmed with grief and worry and anxiety about the things that are going on. And then you find yourself laying down at night, and before you go to sleep, here you go again, you start praying again. David is laying down, and he is laying on his bed, and he meditates in the night watches. And notice in verse 7, it is God's help, isn't it? Because you have been my help, therefore in the shadow of your wings I will rejoice. He is talking about in the past tense here, isn't he? He's talking about remembering in his life when God has been a help to him. So what does he do? He remembers. Can I say this directly to you right now? Is that when you're going through any kind of distress, you need to remember how God has worked in your life in the past. Then that reminds you that you need to trust him now and in the future. God is one of his attributes, if that's a good word to use, is that he is unchangeable. God is steadfast and loyal love in the past, and you can depend on him and trust him to be the same in the future. Well, sometimes we're in these situations and we think, well, where is God and what is God doing? And I feel all alone and I feel forsaken. Dear friend, remember that how God has worked in the past, and it will cause you to rejoice in the present. Notice in verse 8, you have strength, don't you? I love that last phrase there. My soul follows close behind you. That's key, isn't it? It is someone who adheres to God, abides in God, trusts God, and makes God the leader and Lord of his life. Oh, it's so sad that people forget about God and they think that they're going to be the master of their own domain. They're going to be the captain of their ship. And dear friend, the Lord needs to be the captain of your ship. It is someone who you follow and you stay close behind, you adhere to. You're right there behind him and you're adhering to him. And notice the strength. Your right hand upholds me. I don't know of another more encouraging little phrase than that, to know that God's right hand is holding you up. God's right hand the strength of his arm is right there, and he is bolstering you and being able to support you in your life as you go through these things. Well, the last thing I want you to know in this text is confident in his preservation. The psalmist has moved all the way from distress, and then he finds joy, and now he finds confidence. He finds confidence in the fact that God is going to see him all the way through his life, and he's going to take care of him. Notice I'm going to read in verses 9 through 11. But those who seek my life to destroy it shall go to the lower parts of the earth. They shall fall by the sword. They shall be a portion for jackals. And here is the adversative. Here is where it switches gears, right? That was them, and now he talks about himself. But the king, and David is the king, shall rejoice in God. And now here comes the universal nature of it. And this is where there's a great application for you. You are everyone here, right? Everyone who swears by him shall glory, but the mouth of those who speak lies shall be stopped. There is a confidence that the psalmist has at this point, and he anticipates the destruction of his enemies. He anticipates that God is going to work in his life, and there is an anticipation of two things. First of all, in verses 9 and 10, he's going to turn the wicked to destruction. Notice what it says there in verse 9, that those who are trying to kill him, those who are trying to destroy his life, they have a destination, don't they? They're going to go in the lower parts of the earth. This could be a reference to hell, but at the very least, it's a reference to death. It's a reference to destruction. It's a reference that they are no longer going to be blessed. They are no longer going to be uplifted in life. God will deal with the wicked, and they will go in the lower parts of the earth. And notice in verse 10, he goes on, and he's still talking about those, the wicked, the ones who are trying to destroy him. He says, they shall fall by the sword, and they shall be a portion for jackals. It's a really a gruesome scene there, isn't it? It's a scene that when these people had come against David with swords, their sword will be turned upon themselves, and they will meet the destruction of which they sought him to be destroyed. They sought for him to be destroyed, yet they are the ones who are going to be destroyed. It's really a gruesome picture there where it says, there shall be a portion for jackals. This is a very... I can't even think of the word right now, but what an awful death that is. And it's not a death of honor, is it? It's not an outcome of them having a great funeral, of them being honored in their death. Disgrace, that's the word I was looking for. This is a very disgraceful and just sad end for them to be, that their bodies are being a feast for wild animals. And so these, as they come out there in the wilderness and as they are seeking David's life, they're going to fall by the sword, and then they're going to be food for wild animals. Notice in verse 11, here is where it turns to two different ways, two different outcomes, and there is joy and praise for the believer and for the one who is righteous, for the one who says, "Oh God, you are my God." And then you have in the same verse the outcome for those who sought to destroy his life. Notice what it is. But the king shall rejoice in God. And he's talking about himself. King David is going to rejoice in God. And notice this, everyone who swears by him shall glory. This everyone who swears by him is someone who is committed to God and calling him my God, is faithful and obedient to him, and is understanding and grasps the importance and the great blessings of the loyal, steadfast love of God. Everyone who adheres to that and abides in those truths, swears by him, look at this, shall glory. But the mouth of those who speak lies shall be stopped. You notice there that there is an end here, isn't there? There is a time where God is going to deal with this. And it is interesting that the one who is adhering to God, following close by, has been faithful and is right with God, will be vindicated. They will not, there is no end to them. They are eternal beings, while there seems to be an end to the ones who speak lies. While the believer and the faithful one has been delivered by God and been vindicated by God, they are still praising God. Their mouths are still moving in praise. They are still worshiping God. But the ones who speak lies, the ones who said that God is not going to help you, and the ones who said that God will be of no help to you, their mouth is stopped. They are no longer talking. But the obedient and faithful ones are still praising. I want to close with just a couple of comments here. We talked about the persecution and the suffering that we all go through. And we touched on it this morning. And there's no doubt that God doesn't want you to be surprised by the amount of persecution and suffering that you're going to go through in life. God does not want you to be surprised by the wickedness that you're going to confront and have to live with and live around in your life. That's not going to be any surprise to the believer. Don't be surprised when that is the situation that you find yourself in. But here is what we need to remember, that we will be delivered. He is our God. We will be delivered. And secondly, we will be vindicated. What does that mean, vindicated? Well, it's almost like this. Appearances are not always what they seem. Sometimes it feels like I'm losing. We're getting beat. That was a bad game yesterday. There's a lot of, I guess it depends on who you're rooting for, right? We're getting beat. We're losing. It's not going well. But guess what? In the life of a believer, when God is in the picture, God is going to win every time. And God triumphs over wickedness. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your word, that we can take it with us, we can apply it to our lives.